Anyway, it's such an honor, first of all, to have Piper Laurie here. I have been a longtime fan. She has an incredible book, which I was talking about backstage, which is called Learning to Live Out Loud. And please read it. Again, one of the things I admire so much about you is that the trajectory of your career, we're going to see this movie tonight when you were under contract at Universal, and these were basically the type of movies that you were going to do until you made a decision to go back to New York to study acting. Sanford Meisner, who was also my teacher, Sanford Meisner, and start doing live television and plays, and then just a complete turnaround doing films like Days of Wine and Roses. That was the television play of Days of Wine and Roses, and then The Hustler, of course, and then, of course, Carrie, which is so iconic, and Children of a Lesser God, and later movies like The Grass Harp. So that's what I find to be so interesting about your career. And we're going to be talking about Rock Hudson tonight. And you were under contract with him at Universal. And what I wanted to, he's such a good-looking fellow, and I guess I'm going to be handing the microphone over to you. But I guess I just want to hear, what were when you first met him and your impressions, because you screen tested with him, right?
Sorry about the mic.
That's okay.
Rock and I started at the same time at Universal. I was 17 and he was, I think, 23 or 24. And we both auditioned and they decided to screen test us together. We did a scene from a movie they made later on called Thunder on the Hill. And I was a very young 17-year-old and I looked 14. And I had this line that just cracked me up. I couldn't get out. I love you like this, all stirred up with fire in your eyes. But we made the test, and then we waited for about 2 weeks to find out if they were going to sign us. And during that time, he became a really good buddy. I don't think he had many friends in town at that time. And we lived in a little apartment house, and my mother was a great cook, and Rock loved to eat. And we had lots of meals, and then one day he and a contract player, Jimmy Best, and one of my good friends, Bob Richards, took me to my first circus. These three big guys took me, and it was a fantastic day. I remember every detail. I remember the color of the chair I was sitting on, waiting for them to pick me up.
That's so great.
And then we were cast together in a couple of movies, and I think this was the first one that we did together.
You said in your book that he suffered from stage fright.
Me or him?
That Rock Hudson did.
Well, just a moment ago we were talking about it. Mark asked me if I had ever seen any of the musicals, the plays that he did later on, and I really regret that I was not able to see that, because I was witness to his first stage appearance. At Universal, they decided to have all the contract players do scenes or something on the Phantom stage, which was the actual set of the original Phantom of the Opera. Wow. It was a beautiful stage that they kept in good shape. And all the contractors worked on scenes and things. And Rock had a sophisticated scene to do with an actress. And we were waiting for the show to begin, and he was backstage. And this giant, great guy with such authority, who became a hit later on stage, was so frightened. He was a child, just trembling and perspiring, and I held him. He was like a child, really, and I tried to give him courage. He was like a baby. It's amazing, wonderful how he grew. It's amazing. I really wish I'd seen that.
I swear I'm gonna get to you, I swear. I'm curious, when you were all under contract in Universal, I wanted to talk a little bit about two things, basically. Did he think he was a good actor? Did he want to be a better actor? And when you were under contract at Universal, did you, all the contract players, did you kind of hang out, or was it unusual for you and Rock to kind of become friends?
I was lucky because they put me to work right away. But every once in a while I had a little time off and I could attend the acting class. And then sometimes we all go out for lunch to the Bob's Big Boy nearby and go in an open convertible. And Rock was so trusting. He'd just say anything about himself. It was very dear. He just trusted everybody. And I felt much closer to him than I think any of the other contract players.
Like, what did he say?
What?
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
It's okay. If we wait till the end.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I know you're excited. So. All right, sir, it's your turn. Of course, why did you want to write a book about Rock Hudson? And what was something you discovered about him that really surprised you?
So the first part of the question was, I took a very close look at all of the previous books that had been written about Rock and looked at the documentaries, and there had been a fair amount of them. And I just felt in the case of the books, for example, that they weren't particularly comprehensive, or they didn't really take that deep dive that I felt his life and career really warranted. So I said it's time to take a second look, because so much time has passed since his death and the hysteria that surrounded the way that he died. In terms of the most surprising thing, I'm going to give you a 50-50 answer. I would say on the cheerier, bright side of things was how loved he was. I mean, it's unusual to get 3 people to agree on something, but I did over 100 interviews for this, and I talked to classmates of his from Winnetka, Illinois, who went to high school with him, and then I talked to other people who were at his bedside when he died, and every single one of them, without exception, said something positive and affirming about Rock. And I think that's really rewarding, really revealing about his character. On the unhappy, darker side of things, I was kind of shocked to learn how often he was blackmailed throughout his life, and the victim of extortion plots. And oftentimes these originated with people, sadly, who were pretty close to him, that he had romantic entanglements with, or marriages, let's say. So that was shocking. So on the brighter side of things, it was really nice to hear how loved he was and universally respected.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask, which surprised me in your book, is that, which I had never heard about, was that he had a very unhappy childhood. And that really shaped my impression now of seeing him in movies, because as you write in the book, so often he played characters with almost a kind of a dual identity. And then you get to a movie like Seconds, which we're going to get to, in which it's literally submerging an identity. And that's why I find him cinematically so fascinating. But I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure, so Rock's early life in Winnetka was pretty grim and bleak. His biological father abandoned the family in 1931 at the height of the Depression, and Rock and his mother were sort of left to fend for themselves. And his mother, Kay, had to sort of really scramble to find work at a time when millions of people were not employed. And then a few years later, she remarried a former Marine, Wallace Fitzgerald, who unfortunately was very hot-tempered, alcoholic, abusive to not only Rock, but his mother. And people will say to me, well, how do you know that? You know, these are sort of accepted stories, but how does a biographer know that that is actually true? Very interestingly, I hired a genealogist to help me with the research, and she found the divorce transcripts from both of Rock's mother's divorces. And in the second one, to the abusive former Marine, you actually can read testimony from neighbors, friends, family members who remember, you know, seeing Rock black and blue, or the mother bearing evidence that she had been battered. And it's really chilling to read all of that because it very much brings the history to life. So I do think, unfortunately, although Rock never carried himself as a tragic person, I think he was very good-humored and good-natured. Throughout his life, I think he had to grapple with a lot of dark elements, which is a testament, again, to who he was, that he was able to overcome all of that and not, you know, be a sad sack about all of that. You know, he's very noble in some ways, I think.
Good at keeping secrets.
Very good at keeping secrets. I noticed this recurring refrain in a lot of the interviews where he would say, I just learned to keep my mouth shut, which is very appropriate to so many aspects of his life.
Yes. And now for a couple of the fun things, how did he get the name Rock Hudson? And did Jane Wyman, in fact, is it true that she kept him from getting fired on that movie, which is what I've always heard, but that she had kept him from getting fired on all the hits, but who knows, that's a rumor. You're the expert.
So the first part of the question was
How did he get the name?
So the name came, according to legend, it came from Henry Wilson, the omnipresent agent, and he combined the Rock of Gibraltar with the Hudson River. Some people told me it was actually the Hudson automobile, which was very sleek and strong looking. But he was trying to find a name to carve this identity that signified strength and power, to fit this 6'4" Adonis in training. So I think that's where the name came from, Henry Wilson. And then he always did credit Jane Wyman as being really helpful and supportive of him on, the first film they did together was Magnificent Obsession, directed by Douglas Sirk, who also directed tonight's film. And that was the first time that Rock, has anybody seen My Gal? Was the first time that Rock was teamed with Piper Laurie, and the first of an 8-picture collaboration with Douglas Sirk. And it's a great, charming, fun, breezy, entertaining movie. So I think you'll like it a lot if you haven't seen it.
Great. And then what I wanted to ask about too was that something I had asked Piper, did he consider himself a good actor? He certainly seems like in Giant is such a great example. I love watching him versus James Dean, just completely two different acting styles, but I don't really feel he was given his due as an actor, and so I was wondering if that's something that hurt him or that he talked about.
The late Julie Adams, who I interviewed with from Universal, I think she put it best. She said she believed that Rock never received his full credit as an actor. And she said if you look at 50s performances from some of the major actors who were popular at that time, and we won't name names, but now, to our eyes, they seem very, little bit showboaty, or they're letting you know that they're acting. Whereas Rock, by comparison, now seems very restrained and natural. And I think he always strove to be the best actor that he could be. And I think that that's something that he wanted from the beginning. When he was first under contract to Universal, I don't think he had the opportunity to show what a subtle actor he could be, or how nuanced, because he was in a number of sort of low-budget adventure films. And he was playing Arabs or prize fighters or thugs in some cases. So there weren't those opportunities that came later, like Giant or Seconds, which he's magnificent in. I think that's one of the best of his films. And I think the best, for my money, the best performance, actually. But
Yeah. Okay, now, because you had mentioned Douglas Sirk, and then I thought we could, and I wanted to ask you, Piper, also about working with Douglas Sirk and watching, since you worked with him in this film, and then subsequent Rock Hudson performances in Douglas Sirk films. That was a mouthful.
Douglas Sirk. Well, I have great mixed feelings about working with Douglas Sirk. I love what he accomplished with Rock. I thought it was, and what Rock did with himself. I don't remember Douglas Sirk on this movie that you're going to see. But I do remember the next time he directed me, in a movie where I was given really stupid lines to say, and I don't, a lot of actors, it's really hard to memorize something that's so untruthful. I have a block, and I was having a problem, and I kept blowing the line, and he really lost his temper with me, and oh God, did he. I know he does not love me at all, so, but he smiled and loved me in this, and I just respect him so much for having a friendship with Rock and helping him to grow as he did. It's amazing. I don't think Rock considered himself an actor at all. He knew people thought he was handsome, and he felt, I think, an obligation to look well and to not get fat and this and that. But he never thought seriously about himself as an actor. It was beautiful to see what happened.
I'm curious too, and then as we talk about Rock Hudson, as he gets into the persona, the 1950s and the 1960s, which the Doris Day Rock Hudson, I mean the full-blown Rock Hudson, Pillow Talk, and do you think that he ever had, and it's interesting as he goes into the 70s and then he does TV, but Rock Hudson, Doris Day, it almost seems like it kind of went out of fashion, and then for him to come back and to have AIDS and the lightning rod and his whole homosexuality, which had been uncovered, is that something that you talk about in your book? I mean, just the wild swings in his persona.
yeah, there is a lot of different phases to Rock, I think it's fair to say. So the Doris Day films are the trio of them, which you've probably all seen, and they hold up. They're products of their time. Like Pillow Talk was released in '59, so it's celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, which is hard to believe. But what's interesting about the Doris Day films is prior to Pillow Talk, he had virtually appeared in no comedies, with this being a rare exception. They were almost all dramas or adventure films. And at first he was a little reluctant to take it on because, believe it or not, he considered the script a little bit risque. But by today's standards, it's incredibly tame and playful and fun. And yes, there is this other transition that happens in the 70s where what's a little sad is I felt when Rock was really hitting his stride as an actor, 1966 with Seconds particularly for John Frankenheimer, what a great raw performance, something you wouldn't expect from him. And he's really attempting to diversify at that point. He does Pretty Maids All in a Row for Roger Vadim, where he plays the heavy, so that's something you wouldn't expect from Rock Hudson either. But whenever he would veer away from his persona, the fan base tended to resist. So I'm sure that was frustrating on some level. And then in the latter part of the 60s, he attempts like a quasi-musical, Darling Lily with Julie Andrews, and that proves to be disappointing. So then comes this offer to do television, and I think quite wisely he recognized that that was a good transition point for him. And then beyond his movie celebrity, you get to the disclosure about his diagnosis in 1985. And to the industry at large, I don't think that it was shocking, the revelations about his sexuality. But I do think to fans, the housewives out in Peoria, Illinois, it was startling. And so there's a whole new, now he's transcending movie star celebrity, and he's becoming sort of the poster boy for a global pandemic, something he would have never foreseen. And I think it was the great Randy Schultz said there was AIDS before Rock Hudson and there was AIDS after. And it's simply because he was so well known, so loved and revered as a great star, that finally mainstream middle America had this face to put with the epidemic. Oh, this is not something that's just happening to Haitians or intravenous drug users. Rock Hudson, whom we've all seen grow up in front of our eyes, can have this dreaded disease. So many different transformations to that life and that career.
Yeah, it's hard, again, it's so shocking because it seems very normal, but you have to remember back when this was happening, how shocking it was. And was there any, I know I wanted you to talk a little bit about, it seems so tragic, he had to anonymously write letters to people that may have been with him, and how did he cope with this diagnosis, and did he think about this lasting legacy, competing with his movie legacy?
Yeah, he did do some very admirable things, I think. He enlisted the aid of his great friend, the actor George Nader, to write letters to people he had partnered with and he was expressing to them that you should go see your doctor and have a checkup, and told them why anonymously, but he did make that effort. And I'm sorry, I forgot what the second part of it.
Did he have an idea that that people would remember him more for dying of AIDS than for his films?
I think that initially that may have been a fear, but I heard that he received over 30,000 letters of fan support, including one from Madonna, whom he didn't know. But I think that sort of changed his attitude. He was in mortal dread that when the public found out about his diagnosis, that they would turn against him. And I guess surprisingly and positively, when he saw that there was that level of support, that had to have been very affirming to him, I'm sure.
And I wanted to ask, what are some of the qualities that you love about watching Rock Hudson in movies? I know there's certain things I love. I love his smooth, velvety voice. And those Douglas Sirk, or I'm thinking of Pillow Talk. I keep going back to Pillow Talk. But I love his voice, and he always seems to be kind of winking at the audience. But what are some of the qualities you like?
Early on, when he screen tested at 20th Century Fox with Kathleen Hughes, an unnamed executive, I found a production report where they were reacting to his screen test. And they said he has a very unique, undefinable appeal. And I thought, bingo, that's exactly what there was this certain kind of warmth and charisma that carried him through the entire career, I think. And comedically, I think he really hit his stride. A lot of the reviews for Pillow Talk said that he's really the successor to Cary Grant, that he's going to carry this torch as a great light comedian. And I think he did it beautifully, and they have such sublime chemistry, as he does with Piper Laurie, and has anybody seen My Gal in The Golden Blade? Yeah, and again, I think whatever you threw at him, particularly later on, he could make it work, And I think the higher the bar was set, the better the results were.
As you were talking, I was thinking Orson Welles said only, movie stars look better in black and white, but he for me, is sort of born to be in color. I think of him in his plaid shirt, you know, in All That Heaven Allows. He had the great ability, I thought, to sometimes say the craziest, most stilted dialogue, you know, in Magnificent Obsession. When he's the doctor, you know, they're going to save her sight and everything, and you just completely believe it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the movie because you mentioned somebody I love, Charles Coburn, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Charles Coburn.
Oh, I have so much to say about Charles Coburn. He was in the very first movie I made.
Yeah.
And I loved him. He was fantastic. And I have so much to say about it, but I just don't want to miss talking about Rock's, this strange, interesting gift that he had with women and famous actresses, Doris Day, Elizabeth Taylor, certainly with me, of finding humor and fun and laughter. It was what you did when you were with The Rock. You laughed, and it was a great gift that he had. And I don't know how he did that or where it came from, but you always felt like you were the only one he had that kind of fun with. Yeah. Do you understand that? And I haven't gotten that far with your book, but I definitely will. Do you talk about it in the book?
Absolutely. In the documentary that you'll see a little bit later, Jane Withers said he had a delicious sense of humor and always brought a lot of joy and fun to the set. So I think largely because of the way that he died, we don't tend to think of him that way. We tend to think of him and that's appropriate to think of him sadly because of
I always
that.
think of it as a laugher.
Yes,
I
yeah.
had a good time with Rob.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, good humored and had a great, wonderful sly sense of humor. I've heard was also a bit of a prankster too, is that true? Like he liked to play practical jokes sometimes on people? Is that
No, he
right?
never did that with me.
Okay, he knew better. But yeah, I think this is someone that, and I hate to read depictions of him where they dumb him down because I think he was a very intelligent person, you know, very smart. Maybe not the most sophisticated because he didn't have time to go to college, but quite smart in his own way, you know. I've heard he loved to play word games like Scrabble and that he was really good at it. So.
Curious, how did he get the part in Seconds?
That's really interesting. Initially, I think it had been offered to Kirk Douglas, or Kirk Douglas really wanted to play it and play, this is a dual role in Seconds where you have sort of a before version of this very paunchy, older, aging man who's dissatisfied with his life. And then he goes through this radical transformation and emerges as a painter in Malibu with a mistress, and it's a very glamorous existence. So the whole piece is about identity and exchanging sort of in Faustian terms your identity. And then they came across, Kirk Douglas couldn't do it due to other commitments, so they then went to Laurence Olivier, who was also gonna play both sides of the character. And the studio, Paramount, said, well, it's a nice choice, but we need more marquee insurance. We need a bigger box office name. And that's where somebody suggested Rock. And it was Rock who had the idea that the character should be played by two different actors. So John Randolph plays the before, and Rock ended up playing the after. And I think that that was a really smart choice, because then it becomes all the more startling that you're looking at this totally different person.
Oh, brilliant.
Absolutely.
And I know you had a question. I don't want to jip you. What was your what was your question?
Oh, are you talking about me?
Yes.
Oh, it was, when Piper was saying he was disclosing things to you that surprised you, could you give an example? When you were talking about Rock, when you were with Rock, he would be open to you and he would tell you things that surprised you that he would share with you? Can you give an do you remember any example of something like he would have said?
I'm sorry, my hearing
Oh,
ain't great anymore.
maybe Eliana can,
Sure. He was asking, he said you were mentioning before that Rock would always surprise you and tell you little surprising things, and was there anything that he ever told you that surprised you? You're smiling.
Yes, but I think I must be discreet.
okay, good answer.
No, it was just something that was very open that I at that time, I thought it was in bad taste and I sort of cringed. But it was something very open and human and it didn't bother anybody else, but, you know, I just was a little embarrassed. And also, he was about to work with somebody famous. And he said something very negative. He'd never met this person. And he said something really awful about her. And that he was afraid, you know, this and that. And he ended up having a very long friendship with her. But he was just so, in those days anyway, unafraid and uncensored and in contrast to years and years later, I had been living in New York for many years, and I was doing theater, and I went to have lunch with Maureen Stapleton, and we were walking down Columbus Avenue. Whoops. Whoops.
Can I?
Sure,
Oh.
absolutely.
And,
Gotta have your hat on.
Hudson, this was when he was a big, big star. And
And he was about half a block away, but you know, he was so big, you recognized him. And Rock, and Maureen said, Rock! And we started running towards him, and he saw, this corner of his eye, he saw us, and he thought we were fans running after us. And the faster we ran, the faster he ran. And he tucked into a shop, and we had almost caught up with him, and he came out again, he ran again, we were yelling, Rock! God, it must have been 30 years since I'd seen him, and it would have been nice.
Oh.
You did say you got to see him later on.
Yes, several months, I think, before he went to France to die, you know, I had heard and, you know, read that he was very ill. And he came to a tea party in a little home. We had a mutual friend. And I hadn't seen him since running down after him on the street, years and years. And he was very changed, of course. And he was happy to see me, and I was happy to see him. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time with him.
And does anyone else have any other questions?